The brownstone on South King Drive had stood for more than a century, its red brick darkened by time and Chicago winters. It had survived riots, recessions, redlining, and renewal schemes. For Margaret Lewis, it was more than a house, it was proof that her family had endured. She had taught history in Chicago public schools for 38 years, and every lesson she ever gave seemed to echo through those walls. She never imagined she would one day be locked beneath them. Margaret was 74, retired, and sharp despite the arthritis in her hands. Her husband, Henry, 76, was not doing as well. Years of factory work had left his lungs weak, and congestive heart failure made each step an effort. They had planned to grow old together in the brownstone, hosting grandchildren they never had, donating books to neighborhood schools, tending the small backyard garden that refused to die no matter how many developers circled the block. Their son, Calvin, had always said the house was too big for them now. At first, his concern sounded loving. He was a rising star in Chicago real estate, always in tailored suits, always talking about revitalization and opportunity zones. He offered to help manage the house when Henry's health declined. Then he suggested they move to the basement temporarily while renovations happened upstairs. He said it would be safer, easier, warmer. Margaret trusted him. She shouldn't have. The basement had once been a coal cellar, its windows narrow and high, the walls painted an institutional gray. Calvin installed a keypad lock at the top of the stairs, explaining it was for security. He said crime was rising. He said he worried about them. Weeks passed. Then months. The keypad stayed locked. Calvin took over the main floors, hosting investor meetings where Margaret could hear laughter and clinking glasses through the vents. He began referring to the brownstone as his property in emails. "My inheritance, just early," he joked to colleagues. Margaret asked to come upstairs for fresh air one afternoon. Calvin said later. He didn't come back. Henry's health worsened. His breathing became shallow at night, and Margaret lay awake counting the seconds between each inhale, terrified one would be his last. She begged Calvin to let them move back upstairs. He told her she was being dramatic. He said doctors said Henry was stable. He said everything was under control. One night, during a power outage, Henry asked Margaret to bring him the old cedar box she had hidden in the corner behind storage shelves. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. She hadn't seen it opened in decades. Inside was a yellowed envelope, brittle with age. "I should have told you sooner," Henry whispered. "I was afraid. Afraid of what it would do to us. Afraid of what it would do to him." The letter was dated 1974. It bore the seal of a now-defunct adoption agency on the South Side, one later exposed in a corruption scandal involving coerced adoptions and falsified records. Margaret remembered the headlines. She remembered testifying as a journalist before she became a teacher, writing about missing black children and forged consent forms. The letter confirmed what Henry had carried alone for 50 years. Calvin was not their biological son. They had been told his mother died in childbirth. That he had no family. That the adoption was clean. It wasn't. He had been taken from a living mother during the height of institutional abuse, when poor black families were stripped of children deemed better placed elsewhere. Henry had discovered the truth years later but buried it to protect their family. Margaret sat on the cold floor as the weight of it settled into her bones. The son who now treated them like obstacles had been rescued from cruelty, raised with love, given every advantage they never had. And now he had buried them alive. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't scream. The journalist in her, the one she thought she'd left behind, woke up. She began documenting everything. Dates. Times. Audio recordings of Calvin's dismissive visits. Photos of the locked door. Medical records showing neglect. She reached out quietly to former colleagues, investigative reporters who owed her favors from decades past. When the story broke, it detonated across Chicago. Developer accused of elder abuse in historic Brownstone, the headlines read. Then came the second wave. Adoption scandal ties prominent real estate mogul to 1970s child trafficking case. The documents Margaret leaked didn't just expose Calvin's cruelty, they exposed his lies. His carefully curated identity unraveled. Investors fled. Banks froze accounts. City contracts vanished overnight. Calvin stormed into the basement when the news hit, shouting, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits. Margaret looked at him calmly and told him to leave. She told him the locks were being changed. She told him the house was never his. Henry passed away 2 weeks later, upstairs, in his own bed, sunlight on his face. Margaret buried him beneath the oak tree in the backyard, the same tree they planted the year they adopted Calvin. She did not invite her son. The Brownstone reopened a year later, but not as a home. Margaret transformed it into a living museum. Each room told a story of Black educators, journalists, laborers, artists. Artifacts she had collected quietly over decades finally had a place to breathe. School groups lined up on the sidewalk. Elders told stories in the parlor. Children touched history with their own hands. Margaret sat at the front desk most days, greeting visitors. When asked why she did it, she always answered the same way. Because history doesn't belong in basements. And somewhere in the city, a disgraced developer learned, too late, that inheritance is not taken. It is earned. The story didn't end when the museum doors opened. That was only the moment the city finally caught up to what Margaret Lewis had been carrying her whole life. In the months after Henry's death, grief came in waves. Some days Margaret felt steady, grounded by purpose. Other days she reached for her phone to tell Henry about a child's question or a donor's generosity, only to remember there was no one on the other end anymore. She learned to sit with the silence instead of fighting it. Teaching had trained her for that, knowing when to speak and when to let meaning settle on its own. The Brownstone filled with people again, but this time with intention. Retired Pullman porters brought photographs their families had hidden in shoeboxes for generations. Former students donated essays Margaret had graded decades earlier, margins filled with her looping handwriting. One woman arrived carrying a fragile quill stitched by her grandmother during the Great Migration, tears streaming down her face as she said, "I didn't know where else this belonged." Margaret listened. Always listened. Calvin tried to surface once more. His lawyers sent letters threatening defamation suits, demanding retractions, accusing Margaret of exploiting private family matters. She forwarded every letter to the museum's legal counsel and never replied directly. The city already knew the truth. The courts did too. At a zoning hearing meant to determine landmark status for the Brownstone, Calvin appeared unexpectedly. His suit no longer fit quite right. The confidence that once filled rooms had leaked out of him. He sat in the back, arms crossed, watching as historian after historian testified about Margaret's collection, her career, her contribution to Chicago's cultural memory. When Margaret took the podium, the room fell silent. She did not mention Calvin by name. She spoke instead about homes as witnesses, how walls remember what people try to forget. She talked about teachers who saved documents when schools closed, about mothers who had letters from children taken too soon, about the danger of letting history be owned by those who value profit over truth. The vote was unanimous. The Brownstone was protected forever. After the hearing, Calvin approached her outside. For the first time, he looked smaller than she remembered. "You didn't have to destroy me," he said. Margaret studied him carefully, the way she once studied students on the verge of learning something painful but necessary. "I didn't destroy you," she replied. "I told the truth. What it destroyed was the version of you built on lies." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to argue with. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret established a fellowship for young Black journalists and educators, funded by donations from people who believed in what the Brownstone stood for. She named it after Henry. Not because he sought recognition, but because he had lived quietly, doing the right thing even when it terrified him. On the anniversary of Henry's death, Margaret sat alone in the museum after closing. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting warm colors across the floor. She placed the old adoption letter in a display case, not as an accusation, but as a warning. Truth always survives concealment. Margaret Lewis, once confined to a basement, now stood at the center of a living archive. Her voice carried farther than it ever had in a classroom. Students still learned from her, only now, the lesson was bigger. Power doesn't come from what you take. It comes from what you protect. And history, once reclaimed, can never be locked away again. Years later, when Margaret could no longer climb the front steps without pausing, the brownstone carried her name. The Margaret Lewis House for Black Memory and Justice opened on a quiet June morning. There were no celebrities, no politicians giving long speeches. Just neighbors, former students, teachers, elders, and children sitting cross-legged on the front lawn, listening. Margaret stood at the podium one last time. Her voice was softer now, but steady. "I spent my life teaching history from textbooks," she said. "What I learned too late is that the most important history is what we protect when no one is watching." She looked up at the windows, the ones she had once been locked behind. "This house tried to forget us. We refused." When Margaret passed away peacefully the following winter, the city mourned her like a matriarch. School buses lined the block. Students she had taught 50 years earlier brought their grandchildren. Letters arrived from across the country, from widows, teachers, journalists, and people who said her story helped them reclaim something stolen. Calvin did not attend the funeral. In her will, Margaret left him nothing material. Only a letter. "You were loved more than you ever understood. But love does not excuse harm. If you ever choose truth over power, the doors will be open." The brownstone still stands. Children still walk through its halls. Stories still breathe in its walls. And every visitor who descends into the basement sees a single plaque, mounted where the keypad lock once hung. No one is buried here anymore. Margaret Lewis, the woman once silenced beneath her own home, became its eternal voice. And the house, finally, told the truth.